This evening, I'm going to be talking about chemical thinning for bloom and petal fall because that's the area that we're in right now. Let's see. Okay. The orchard probably are most orchards here in Massachusetts. They're either a bloom or perhaps early petal fall. And the bloom so far has been the bloom should be good because we had relatively few had low set last year, and we had what I would consider to be no cold events that weaken these flowers. So the problem now is the weather, which is very unfavorable, and it's predicted for the next at least 10 to 12 days to not even get into the 70s, if so it'll get up there perhaps later on. So if you decide to do thinning, I think you're going to have to be a little bit more aggressive, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I've suggested to do aggressive thinning previously, but for different reasons. Now, because of the cold weather, we're going to have an extended bloom period. The cool temperatures will keep the flowers viable for a lot longer period of time. Now, this is the $64 question, and this is the question I think that each one of you has to answer yourself. As Jaime pointed out, the relatively few insects flying, and he mentioned even bees and all the pollinators. And so the assessment of the pollination in your orchard, I think, is a judgment call that you have to make. And now it's a judgment call, but the first inclination that you have a flower setting is when the calyx starts to turn upward. That's a good indication. And then when you get to be about the 5 to 6 millimeter stage, you can start to see seeds developing. But that's the later portions of where you're going to be thinning. So the assumption I'm making in this presentation is that the pollination will be adequate. But if you, in your orchard, you excuse me, think that it is not, then you may want to be less aggressive than I'm suggesting. Okay, now as I said, we're probably between full bloom and somewhere in petal fall, and because of the weather situations, I think it's not so much weather that you're going to be choosing, but it's going to be wind and rain and whatever that will determine whether you get out there or not. So this is a little bit different situation we've had in the past because we know that it's going to be rather unfavorable for thinning over the next 10 days. Now, what are the thinners we use at bloom and petal fall? Now, I've decided not to talk about caustic blossom thinners. I think we're perhaps a little bit beyond that anyway. And I'm listing here the two major ones and another one: naphthalene acetic acid, naphthalene acetamide, or imethin. And I list ethivon here as a possibility, although relatively few of you use that. And I'm not mentioning promo, and that can also be used as well. But I'm not mentioning Maxell because this is not a time that I recommend the application of Maxell. Now, another thing I'd like to emphasize is the fact that any thinner that goes on at bloom and petal fall will not be as potent as when it is applied later on. And so I almost use the rule of thumb that if a thinner goes on at 7 to 14 millimeters at a certain rate, it will only be half as effective if it puts on it at bloom and petal fall. So don't be too concerned if I'm recommending higher rates than you normally would use. Okay, NAA is, everyone knows what NAA is. It's been around for 75 years. It's time tested. And I'm recommending the use of application of 10 to 12 parts per million. Uh, and that's pretty much across the board. I want to get things started, particularly in in the weather conditions that we have right now. Um, Anything less than that, I think, will probably not be would be not very effective. Uh, NAD or naphthalene acetamide, I think there's been a renewed interest in the last few years. It is a weaker thinner than NAA. It has a reputation for being a consistent thinner and rarely overthins. And I recommend the use of 8 ounces per 100 gallon. This is the highest rate allowed on the label. And because it is such a weak thinner, I think it can be used in almost anything at that rate. Ethifon. Relatively few growers use this, but for completeness, I am including it here. The suggested rate is 300 parts per million or a pint per 100, and some have had success with 400 parts per million. And it's not as consistent as perhaps some of the other thinners, but I think that it's worthwhile considering anyway, but particularly since it does give off ethylene, and that may be useful in stimulating early flower bud formation. Carbaryl. Now, this is probably one of our most popular thinners in New England because it can be applied over a wide range of concentrations. It's very toxic to bees, so the bees should be out of the orchard, and I guess we should probably not apply that if there's many flowers in the orchard because they will be affected by that. The recommended rate is 1 pint to 1 quart per 100 gallons. And it is routinely combined with NAA and NAD to enhance their activity. I like it with NAA because if you want to get more activity, you don't have to increase the concentration of NAA, which makes that combination a little bit safer. And with NAD, oftentimes you're looking to enhance the thinning activity of this compound. So that's a good way to do it. Okay, I raised this question before, but perhaps it's appropriate to raise it again. What is petal fall? And I've listed three or four possibilities here. When the petals have fallen off most flowers, when bees are removed from the orchard, or when the receptacle reaches 5 millimeters. Now that last one was sort of news to me this year because apparently that's the metric that they may be using in Washington. But it is an important question because it will determine how fruit respond to the thinners. Given the weather forecast for the next 10 days, I suggest an application at early petal fall, then followed by another one 5 to 6 days later. Now, this is assuming that one, you think you have adequate pollination. And my suggestion is because it is so cold, you're going to have to work hard to get any thinnings. So that's your judgment call. Now, given that we just have poor weather prediction for the next 10 days, I think you're just going to have to look for good conditions rather than look for a favorable weather, which is normally what we usually do. So I used to say, just stay tuned. Now here's that slide I showed before, which shows a flower that was either pollinated and then one that was not pollinated. The unpollinated one, you can see the receptacle doesn't grow, and the pollinated one, the receptacle does grow, but it really doesn't start to increase in size until about 6 millimeters. And so during this period of time, you don't see very much happening. Then it starts to increase in size here. So after about 7 days after petal fall, you can start to see growth. Now, I've always said that I more or less disregard the carbohydrate model during pedal fall. In my pedal fall, I defined here 0 to 6 days after. And so if the fruit aren't growing, you certainly aren't going to have much demand for carbohydrate. Now, when you get out here, that is, you can see it started to grow, and then the carbohydrate model certainly will provide good guidance for you. So depends when you put your pedal fall spray on, it will determine how much you rely on that carbohydrate model. Now, our next meeting is going to be probably a week and a half or something like that, 2 weeks, where there's going to be a lot of talk about the 7 to 14 millimeter thinning time, and hopefully our weather will be a little bit better. But I thought I'd spend just a short time talking about one that we haven't talked about very much, a relatively new thinner, and to explain under what circumstances this could work. Now, Proton is the active ingredient of the sialic acid, and this is a naturally occurring plant hormone. What it does is it influences stomatal control, water loss. It adapts trees to stress. It's a growth inhibitor. It's an abscission agent. It's also involved in dormancy, and it's the only hormone thinner that is cleared for use in organic block. So it does have it does have an advantage. Now, the mode of action of Proton is relatively straightforward. Proton regulates stomatal opening and closing. Thus, if you close the stomates, it reduces water loss. However, accompanied with that closing the stomates is also, it inhibits the uptake of carbon dioxide. And what this does is reduces the photosynthesis within a plant. Now, depending upon the lake situation and the temperature situation, Proton can lead to a rather severe carbohydrate stress. Successful thinning with Proton requires a reasonably strong carbon deficit. And I would probably put a figure on perhaps minus 35, minus 40 grams would be when you could start to think about using Proton. Now, if a deficit does not exist, my suggestion is look for another thinner. Now, for 3 years in a row, I did an experiment with Proton on Gala, and I thought I have some temperature data that occurred during the time I put that on. So I thought it would be a good illustration to show how the effectiveness of Proton. I used the same treatments all 3 years. The control ABA at 250 and 500. That's Proton, and those are essentially the rates that are suggested on the label. And then Maxell at 75 parts per million, and then ABA at 250 and 500 plus Maxell. And here you can see that the set wasn't very high this year, but what happened is the ABA did overthin too much. And so if we look why, you come over here and you look at the high temperatures, the high temperatures night, it is blocked here, but you can see 89 on the day of application, 82, 82, 87, 87. Well, I think you'd be very surprised if you wouldn't get thinning with almost any thinner, but certainly did work well with that. Now, the next year, I had the same treatments, and we got what I would consider to be very good thinning, over-thinning with 500 parts per million, and over-thinning when Maxell is applied with ABA. And if you look at the temperatures, 70 the day of application, 76, 85, 85, and 74 for the following days. So you can see it was very warm temperatures there. And so it explains why we got really good thinning with the Proton. And then here's the third year, and this year uh, the numbers go a little bit all over the place, but there was no statistically significant thinning with any of these treatments. And if you look at the temperature, the day of application was 73. That's reasonable. Then you have 73, 65, 48, which is sort of ridiculous to thin in, and 57 is very low. So that explains why we got almost no thinning over here. So you have to pick your weather conditions when you're deciding to use Proton or not. Now, there's another factor that I think that needs to be mentioned with Proton is leaf yellowing and abscission. Proton causes leaf yellowing and abscission. The severity depends upon the variety. Not all varieties act the same. Now, in many instances, the addition of BA will prevent this from happening. I remember one of the first years I was working with Proton, I had a very simple experiment with 4 treatments. Proton, BA and Proton, and a control. And I applied the treatments, then came back about 3 days later, and I saw the only tree that showed leaf yellowing was the one that received the Proton alone. So my thought was, well, I just forgot to put the Proton in that BA tank, but when I saw that, I made the applications again, and no, it proved that the BA was there, and it did help the yellowing. Now, the yellowing appears within 3 days, and oftentimes the fruit of the leaves are on the ground in 7 or 8 days. So if you blink, they're gone. The smallest leaves in the spur are the affected ones, and so as far as leaf area per se, it's not a large amount. And I've never seen any fruit effects at harvest. So in other words, even if you have yellowing leaves during the bloom period, apparently the reduction in photosynthate there had no significant effect on the final crop. So how to use Proton? Proton is the most effective when weather conditions result in a carbon deficit. So you have to look for something like that. The carbon balance model will be used as a guide. Now, if you recall, when Greg Clark spoke at our March PGR meeting, he suggested elevated temperatures are also important. And all the ones that I showed, elevated temperatures were important. And apparently also this works quite well in Washington State. Of course, they have warmer temperatures than we do. So if favorable weather conditions are not for the forecast, good suggestion is to select another thinner. And be prepared to accept some leaf yellowing. And on the susceptible varieties, I would suggest adding a little bit of BA. And so this is my summary slide. The next 10 days will pose chemical thinning challenges. There are no clear answers for how to proceed. I guess we're more or less flying by the seat of our pants here, but a lot depends upon our pollination weather. If you're very timid in your approach to thinning during unfavorable thinning results are likely to be more disappointing. So if you play it on the conservative side and wait until the 7, 8, or 9 millimeter stage you may have a challenge, but so that's your decision. And the last thing I would mention is rely on past thinning experiences in your farm when you start to formulate your thinning program, because the same recommendation at 2 different farms is not always the same, because people apply different rates and tree row volumes and so on. So that's it.